Hello guys, welcome to Online Web Tutor presented by Profotech Solutions team. I am Sanjay. We are learning CodeIgniter Framework Beginners tutorial. This is our part number 41. Inside this video session guys, we are going to create our custom helper concept in CodeIgniter application. And also guys, if you're a beginner to the channel, please don't forget to subscribe and keep watching our previous video sessions to get the clear concept about CodeIgniter Framework tutorial. So far guys, inside our CodeIgniter series, we have discussed about several types of helpers which is by default provided by CodeIgniter. Now this time we are going to create our own custom helper. So what basically helper is? In our previous video session, we had discussed that a custom helper is made, not basically custom helper, basically all default provided helpers of CodeIgniter is basically the set of functions, the functions we use in our application to execute some of our functionality. So let's say that we have URL helper. URL helper basically provides some of the functions, something called site URL and the base URL. As well as in our previous video session, we had discussed about smiley helper, where we had seen that there are three different functions provided by that helper, and by implementing or by loading that helper, actually we can make use of our comment system to our application. So there are several helpers. So I mean to say that the helpers are the basic set of functions which basically executed to perform any certain task. Now inside this CodeIgniter application, we are going to make our own custom helper. We are going to load in our application and we are going to use that. So back to CodeIgniter. So let's say that if I go to learn helpers, close this file first, and now this is all about routes.php, routes configuration file, and this is the controller so far we have made and studied about all the helpers inside this controller. Now inside this routes.php, I'm going to create a route. So let's say route. So let's say my custom helper. This is the dummy route that we have created, and also we want it to use about the same controller, and inside that let's say my use helper. Now if I copy this method name back to our controller, let's make a method for that. So public function, and this is our method name. Now inside this method, we are going to use our own custom helper functions. So how can we basically create a custom helper in our application? So for that, CodeIgniter provides inside application folder, we have a folder something called helper. So as we can see here, so inside this helpers folder, we can create our own custom helper and we can store all these files inside this folder. Now as we know that all the predefined helpers basically stored, if I back to folder structure, all is stored inside this system and this helpers folder. This is the path actually where the CodeIgniter default helpers actually stored inside this folder. Now if we want to make any custom helper, we have to go inside application and inside this helpers folder. So let's start to create a custom helper. So how can we make a file? Back to CodeIgniter. Now inside this helpers folder, I'm going to create a file. So not directory, it's a file. So new file. Now what will be the basic naming convention for that? Here let's app underscore helper. Now this is the prefix actually we have to add, not prefix, this is the suffix we have to add after the helper name. Now this is the file that we are going to create something called app. Now for the naming convention, we have to add something called app helper.php. Now if I press enter, so successfully we had created our custom helper file something called app underscore helper.php. Now inside this file basically contains all of the functions. We are not going to create any class inside this file. So let's say that PHP tag, simple functions we can define. So let's say function. Now I'm going to create a function, let's say get string length. Now what basically this function will do? This function will take a string parameter and it will return the length of that string. So let's say return, and I'm going to use a PHP function, so strlen, and I'm going to calculate the size and return back to that file. Now if I copy this function name back to our controller, now firstly, to use this function, we have to load this app helper inside our controller. So how can we load that? As we have seen in our previous video session, we have to follow the same syntax to load any helper. So something this load helper, and inside this helper method we have to write only app, not underscore helper. It is by default suffix we have to add with our file name. Now successfully we have loaded that. So if I cut this syntax from here, either we can add inside this array, or even we can separately load inside this method. So inside this method, or we can just go inside this config file, auto load, and inside a helpers array right here, as we can find, and we can pass as a parameter like app here. So we have several options to declare or initialize our helper inside CodeIgniter application. So let's say that, just get rid of that, back to controller, and now we are going to use and declare this helper inside this method. Now we are going to access the function that we have defined inside this file app underscore helper.php. Back to our controller, let's say that echo, and we can directly access this function. So get string length, back here, and this is the function name, and let's say that I'm going to calculate the length of, let's say, online Web Tutor. Save this file, back to browser, and now if I again go to editor, copy this route name, so copy that, back here, and let's say that index.php, and this is our route name. So if I press enter, now 16 is calculated as the size of that string what we have passed inside our controller. So how basically it has counted, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on up to including this space characters. It's all about 16 characters we have. So successfully we have created our first function inside this app underscore helper. We can create multiple functions inside this single file. So let's say that we have an application. Inside that application we have, let's say, 200 of custom helpers. Now any one helper file something contains the same function name. So how can we declare this function again before checking that? What basically I mean that, let's say that out of 200 files, let's say that 5 files, or let's say single file, contains the same function what we have declared here. So before declaring any function, firstly we have to check that this function basically exists or not. If it not exists, then we are going to define that. So let's say that if function exists, so let's say function exists, and inside this function exists we are going to pass this function name as a parameter. So let's say that if this function does not exist, then we are going to define this function inside this if block. Otherwise inside this else block, or we are not going to define that. Inside else block, this function already defined inside any of the helper. So just save this file, back to browser. Now if I reload this page, and as we have some error, something called curl to undefined function, something called function exists, and it is void because we have mistake here. So save this file, again go here, reload this page, and all we have 16 characters. Now go to editor. Now we are going to declare another function inside this file. So let's if, firstly we are going to check that this function basically exists or not. So if function exists, let's say that convert to, let's say, uppercase. Okay, now inside this it means that we have no functions defined with this name. So inside this block, let's say function name, and here we are going to return, let's say return, and str to upper. This is a PHP function we are going to use, and inside this function basically we want a string value, and only we need to return this value, and here we have to put it here. Okay, so save this file, copy this function name, back to our controller, and let's say that if I type a br tag here, so br tag, let's echo, this is the function name, and inside that if I write, let's say Sanjay Kumar, so save this file, back to browser, reload this page. Now as we can see that the name is converted into uppercase because we had used about a PHP function to convert that string. But remember, this is our custom function which we had defined inside our custom helper, loaded successfully and used that. We can access these functions not only inside this controller, we can access all the helper functions basically on a view file inside any of the controller, or we can use inside model also. So let's say that we are going to load a view file here. So this load, let's say view, and inside this view I'm going to call a view file, let's say my hyphen helper. So if I save this file, comment all these lines, so comment that, let's say comment here, comment this line, and if I go inside views folder and I'm going to create a new file, let's say my-helper.php. Now inside this view file I'm going to call our helper function that we have defined here. So if I copy this, convert to uppercase, back to our view file, and let's say inside this file php tag, let's say echo, and if I write, let's say online Web Tutor, so save this file, back here, reload this page. Now as we can see that all the characters is converted into uppercase. Back to editor again. Now what happens basically when we will comment this line? Now by commenting that, this function does not exist anymore because the main thing that the declaration of that helper is commented now. So if I back to browser, reload this page, now as we can see that this function is undefined. So back to editor, uncomment this line, save this file, reload this page. Now we have the output. Let's say that if I open about the database, so let's say database. Now inside here we have this table, something called books, or instead of that, inside this books table, if I ignore all these errors, let's do some entry inside this table. So insert, let's say that cake PHP, and email is something abc@gmail.com, book price let's say 20. Now again if I go here, let's click on go, successfully we have inserted one row. Again if I go here, let's say WordPress theme development, book email, let's say trq something dumb value, gmail.com 50. Again we are going to do one more entry, click insert, and let's say that CodeIgniter tutorial, let's say something dummy value, gmail.com, and this is our price. So if I go to browse, now as we can see that this is my PHP my admin error, so don't worry at all. Now we have 3 records inside this books table. If I back to editor, go inside config folder, database.php file, and if I check about the database connectivity, now inside this default connection, this is what we have made, learn_CodeIgniter. Back to browser, now this is the database. Now let's say that inside our custom helper, we want to access this database table. While accessing, we want all the records should be fetched by using a helper function. So how can we use that? Back to editor, go inside app_helper. Let's say that I'm going to create a function for that. So let's say if function exists, inside this let's say that get all books. Now inside this block I'm going to define that. So function, this is our function name, so pasting it here, and now inside this block we are going to write our query. So write query to get all books from table. Now remember, we are going to make query inside this table. Now it means that we are going to use our DB instance. If I back to slide, open a new tab. So remember, in our previous video we had studied about to access any database, firstly we have to load. By loading that, it means that we have a library, something called database. So firstly we have to load this library. While loading that, we have this db and we can write any of the function to execute or to get the data from our table. So how can we use native libraries or native helpers inside our custom helper? This is our main concern we are going to study. So back to code editor. Now inside this function, what basically we are going to do, we are going to load or let's say ci. This is our variable and we are going to use the native libraries or native helpers, let's say, inside this function. So how can we use that? Ampersand symbol, and we are going to use called getInstance function. This getInstance function basically returns an object copy of our CodeIgniter. By the help of the CI, now we can access or we can call any of the library or any of the helper. So let's say that we are going to load our database. So how can we load? So ci load, and we are going to load our database. So let's say database. So remember, if I back to slides, what basically we had done in our previous video, if we want to load our database to any of the model, what we have done, something called this load, and here we have actually database. So instead of this we have initialized with ci. So if we want to, let's say that if we want to use any native helper inside our custom helper, so what we have done basically, so this load, let's say helper, and let's say that we are going to use, let's say, URL helper. So this is the syntax we have to follow to load any of the controller. Now we are going to use inside this custom helper. So how can we load? ci, let's load helper. Now inside this helper method, we have to pass what basically it is. The main concern of ci is that ci is what? Ci is the instance what we have created by this single line statement. After writing this, means after loading our database, we can access the table and the table's data. So let's say ci, let's say db select. We want to select all the data from the table. Let's say ci db, let's say from. This is the active query syntax what we have done inside previous video. Now we are going to use the table, and the table name is something called books. So if I copy back to editor and if I pasting it here, books, and let's generate the query first. So this db get. Now basically this line will generate a query. So let's say query. Now we are going to execute that. So result equal to, let's say, query, and we are going to use the result method. After that, let's return result. So simply we actually fetched all the data, stored inside this variable, and finally we have returned that. So if I copy this function name back to our controller, and inside this view file, if we go here, just comment this line, let's put or something pre tag to make some formatting to the output data, and let's say print a. We are going to use called get all books. This is the helper function we had defined, and inside this we don't have to pass any parameters right here. So if I save this file, back to browser, reload this page, now as we can see that we have 3 records inside our table. As we go inside this table, now we have 3 records. So the basic concern why actually we have discussed about ci or get instance function inside this app underscore helper. The main concern is that how can we use our native libraries or native helpers inside custom helper. So successfully guys, inside this video we have seen about how we can create our custom helper, how can we use the custom helper functions, as well as we have seen that if we want to use our native libraries and native helpers, so how can we use that. So inside this video session guys, if you have a doubt, then please drop your comment. I will give my reply as soon as possible. So for this video session guys, thank you for watching and have a great day.